I will kick it off. So I hope at this point everybody is familiar with who I am. So I'm going to spare you the bulk of the introductions, other than to reiterate that I'm the Director of Transition Services with Velocity Advisory Group, and a lot of my work is around working with leaders, specifically owners, who are exiting their organization and trying to prepare themselves and their owners and their leadership team for that exit. And then also working with the successors that are coming in and helping position them to be able to step into that leadership role in a way that brings confidence and sustainability to the organization after they leave. So that's where the bulk of my experience around this comes from. And so I really want to emphasize this because I think more often than I'd like to see, preparation of that successor falls off the radar, at least to the level and extent that's needed to really ensure a good quality handoff. So again, we've got a lot of things that are kind of working against owners in this process. The first and probably the biggest issue is that too often they wait till too late in the game to start this process, whether that's thinking about what their exit looks like or how to prepare the business and that sort of thing. So you've got this whole piece around just starting the process too slow. And then there's this realization that, okay, I've got a lot to do to get the company ready for my exit. I've got to get myself ready for my exit. And then you may or may not even know who your successor is going to be. So that process can sometimes be rushed, and that can have really significant consequences for the organization. So we're going to talk a bit about that today. I want to spend some time talking about what succession planning is, what the consequences are of not having a good succession plan, common missteps, some basic succession planning steps to take to get that process rolling, and then how you can prepare your successor once you've selected one to be able to step into that role. To help with that, we have a supplemental guide that I'll share a link for at the end of the webinar. Mike and Bob, make sure I actually share the link this time because I forgot it the last one. So I'll go ahead and throw that in the chat box at the end and you'll be able to download that. What I really like about this guide is there's a successor candidate evaluation form that has some great questions to help you really look at your successor candidates in an objective way. So keep an eye out for that towards the end. But I want to start again by getting a sense of where you're at with things. So I'm going to share that screen again, hopefully, to get some get you all to weigh in here. So give me 1 second just to swap screens. So again, if you can go to menti.com and type in the code 4856-7517, and I'd love to get an idea of where you're at as far as selecting a successor. And it might be that you're just here purely for entertainment purposes and you're not seeing that you're going to be needing to select a successor. Maybe you're planning on an outside sale and you're hoping that they're going to navigate that for you. Feel free to click NA for that, but I'd love to get an idea of where you're at with this. Do you have an idea of who your successor is going to be? Do you have more than one candidate in mind? Do you have no idea? Go ahead and just select which one best suits your organization. I know there are more participants than one person on this webinar. I am looking at the number right here. So there should be some other people who can weigh in here. All right, well, we will move forward with assuming that most of you are not sure who your successor will be, but have one or more candidates in mind. And that actually is probably the case for the majority of people on the call. Generally, you're entering in this with at least a loose idea of who might be stepping into your role. So let's bounce back to the PowerPoint here. So what is succession planning? Basically, you're looking, oops, let me share my screen. Sorry, everyone. Try that again. So basically, it is a strategic process of deliberately identifying the next generation of leaders in your organization. And that can be leadership succession or key role succession. Leadership, you're looking at your C-suite board members. Key role might be a niche role in the organization, or niche, whatever suits your fancy. So that could be, let's say, a lead engineer, or a specific mission critical skill set that you need for the organization. We're focusing for the duration of this webinar on preparing someone to step into the ownership seat, usually your CEO seat of the company. But of course, recognize that what I'm talking about today applies to either type of succession planning, and you really should be considering both, because often is the case that we start working with the company and you've got a leader that's getting ready to retire, and he's got about half his leadership team following suit within the next 1 to 3 years, because they've all been working in the company together for the last 20, 25, 30, 35 years, right? So thinking past just you is probably a good idea, and definitely something that we recommend. So what are some potential consequences of not having a succession plan? Well, obviously you're putting yourself at a lot of unnecessary, yourself and your organization at a lot of unnecessary risk. Thinning of internal loyalty. I think that's something that we don't take into account enough as business owners. You know, again, I touched on this in the last webinar. Your leadership team wants to know what the plan is for them. And if they don't see you thinking long-term on what the organization needs, and they don't see how they fit into that, they're going to be less loyal and have a less of a desire to stick around. So you start losing key people, right? That's where the attrition comes in. Employees want growth opportunities, particularly this new generation of employees coming in. They're all about that. They want to know how they're going to be adding value, what they're going to be learning from you, from your organization. That's just kind of the name of the game now. And so not taking that into account is going to be detrimental to the organization long-term. And also it just projects this lack of organization and structure and planning, right? Having a succession plan should be a part of your strategic planning. Those two go hand in hand. They are one and the same. You need to have a map laying out what your leadership is going to look like and what you're going to need moving forward.
Heather, particularly in family businesses, if the primary owner or the primary leader of that company is not clear about their succession plans, the next gen, if they were vying for positions there, may lose interest in the business or may go external sooner or stay longer.
Yeah. And that is so sad to see. All right. Common misstep number one, procrastination. We've touched on that in every webinar, I think, that we've done in this series, people waiting too long. And I think, there's a lot of different ideas out there around why people procrastinate. I think for this case, a lot of it comes down to fear of the outcome. You're worried you're going to pick the wrong person. It feels way too complicated. How am I going to navigate this, what can feel like this massive change with my people and my team? They've all known me to be the leader for so long. How do I convince them to follow this person over here? What does that look like? How do I prepare them? So it feels complicated. They might just be tired. They've been doing this for 20, 30 years. They don't have a lot of energy to put into this. They're not focused on it because they've got other fires to put out, or they just don't know where to start. And so my hope is with this webinar, we'll give anyone who is feeling any of these reasons, and that's the reason for the procrastination, that it'll help lessen that a little bit so they'll feel more competent in stepping into this and getting the process rolling. And again, I'll stress that the need for this is that you have just as much of a likelihood of leaving for one of these reasons, death, disability, divorce, distress, or disagreement, as you do leaving on your timetable. So take the time to set your company up to be sustainable after you're gone. Overdependence on owner. We talked about this last, this is actually one of the 7 value drivers, right? And so this can be detrimental when it comes to succession situation too. And I think sometimes it's because we may have an internal candidate, let's say, who's been working with us for the last 5, 10, whatever years. And so we have this sense that they know how to do your job. And you don't take the time to start handing those tasks off. You just assume that they're going to know. And that assumption is what gets us into trouble. I think sometimes too, it's delegation avoidance. And so I listed these because these are some of the key reasons people avoid delegating. Just some of the common mindsets that people fall into, not feeling like they have enough time, or that's not going to be done the way that they would want it to be done, or no one knows how to do it. Well, of course, yes, all of those things are likely true to an extent. And all of those have to be addressed if you're going to be successful at this. So again, it falls into that same realm of procrastination. The sooner you start training your replacement, the better off for everyone. And some of it might mean that you need to take the time to reprogram yourself if you're operating with one of these mindsets. Frankly, if you're doing one of these, if you're thinking this way about delegation, probably other people in your organization are too. And so it's probably a systemic issue that you need to focus on. So that's just a little aside. Next one is choosing the wrong person. And a lot of times that's because we're trying to clone ourselves. We think we've done it for the last 20 years. This is how you're supposed to do it. And this is the one way of doing it. And so we're trying to find someone that's just like us. We also might be trying to avoid conflict. Let's say maybe there's an heir apparent. Everybody expects Susie to be stepping in when her dad retires. Susie expects that, but Susie really isn't that great at the job. And we've got somebody else that's an internal employee that's been doing this alongside dad for a number of years, and they really are qualified and competent. But dad doesn't want to have that conversation with Susie, right? So it could be about avoiding conflict. There's a million other reasons that you could be avoiding conflict here. So you may choose the person that is not the best fit. This is why the succession planning process is so critical. It's about getting the right person in that seat and making it an objective step-by-step process. So if for no other reason, do succession planning to help reassure yourself, even if you're confident you know who your successor is going to be, reassure yourself that you're choosing the right person and that you're preparing them adequately and take them through this process. Another thing I think happens is people will assume that they have to sell to an external buyer because they think that their internal employee or their son or daughter may not have the money to purchase, and they need that to be part of this transition. So sometimes we just throw out the idea that can even happen. In reality, there are ways of structuring business deals where your employees can buy in. I'm not talking about an ESOP. I'm talking about something much simpler than that, but your employees or your son or daughter or children can buy in. So you could do a long-term installment plan when they take out a promissory note and pay it back in installment payments with an interest fee. That's going to require little to no money at closing. Or you do a modified buyout where you sell a little bit of the company to them now, a little percentage, and then you sell the rest to them later down the road. Or you could do a managed leveraged buyout where it's some combination of them taking on some debt, but then you're bringing in private equity to help facilitate the rest of that purchase. So there's a few different ways that you can structure this. So if this is something that you haven't thought about, or maybe you want to do, but you're just not quite sure how, bring in some people to help have this conversation, figure out what makes sense for you. This is a great way to ensure that your legacy continues on. If you are able to transition it to somebody that's maybe already in the business or already has a vested interest in your mission, in what you want this company to be moving forward.
Hey, Heather, just add, in addition to those points, there's also the potential for gifting as well. So you can gift portions of your business. And it may be a combination of maybe some installment plan, because you do need some level of income for the years to come, but also a combination of that and gifting. And there's some strategies and structures around that too. And of course, gifting isn't necessarily for every business, but there's a lot of situations, and particularly in family situations, but it doesn't necessarily have to be family that gifting can work.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. That's a good one. I should have added that in here. And I've known a couple of companies now that have done that. They've gifted at least a portion of the company to a son or daughter. Not preparing the right person. So I talked a little bit about that a minute ago. Again, sometimes this is because of procrastination. Sometimes it might be that one of those 5 Ds have happened and there hasn't been time. Sometimes the board wants to accelerate the process for whatever reason, and there isn't sufficient time to build the skill in an existing candidate. Or sometimes, again, like we operate with these, we have our own narratives, we have our own stories we tell ourselves about our business, about our abilities, and about the people in our organization. And we may assume people know things that they just don't know. So again, going through that process of mapping this out, identifying where your candidates are strong and weak, where they need growth, is really critical. So not preparing the right person is the next common misstep people make.
Heather, what I've found is a lot of both first generation of the business and second generation of the business, the majority of their time is spent growing and building the entity of the business. And the notion that they would work to develop their own child or nephew or cousin in that process usually just does not weigh heavily. And there's a high assumption that because their exposure is so significant, both in the business and around the family, that they should get it, whatever get it means. And they should be able to do it in the same way that it has been done. And that should just happen over time, standardly, usually.
Yeah. Through osmosis, right? But it doesn't work that way. So steps to doing this right, steps in the succession planning process. So we're going to go through each of these one at a time. The first is really getting an idea of what position or positions you need to be planning for. And again, like I said, we're focusing on the owner right now, but also keep in mind other critical or key positions that are going to be potentially losing people in the near future. And, it might not be that maybe it's not someone that's approaching retirement, but it's a key position that you just need to make sure that you're grooming someone to step into should someone leave. You want to make sure you've got some depth to the bench there. So identifying what position or positions you need, what the timeline is. Again, like preparing for, I'm just seeing my note, preparing for leaders who have been there with the organization for some time. This is also about, this feeds into those 7 drivers of transferable value too. Some of this is around efficiency as well, because the more you dig into and you start building out these plans for growing your team, the more you'll see roles that maybe need to be more clearly defined in the organization. This is an opportunity to do that. So knowing what positions you need. The other piece I wanted to add too is sometimes as a business owner, especially if you are in the type of business where you've started it, maybe you bootstrapped it, it was just you at the beginning and you've grown it over a period of time, you're probably still wearing many hats. So it might be that as you're getting ready to step out, you need to look at saying, okay, I might be doing the role of 3 people, and I really need to recognize that not everybody is going to be able to do that, and I need to break this out into 2 or 3 different pieces. Maybe I need to bring in a CFO as well because I've been managing that piece, throughout this period of time or whatever. So recognizing that you might need to break your position up a little bit is another piece there. Identifying the job requirements and the competencies. And again, so your job requirements might be like the technical pieces that are involved, like maybe they need to know certain elements of engineering, or, I don't know, how to run certain types of equipment or something like that. That your competencies are going to be things like decision making, problem solving, communication, what job requirements, what skills and competencies do each of these roles need to have, and not just what do they need right now, but what are they going to need moving forward. So again, this whole exercise of succession planning should be a windshield exercise, not a rear view mirror exercise. So what does the organization need moving forward? And you must recognize, as the leader that is exiting, that the organization that you've led up to this point is not the organization that's going to be moving into the next, into the future with this new leadership. The industry has likely changed. The workforce has certainly changed. Your clients have changed. We were talking about that the emphasis on customer service in the last webinar. Your clients are probably expecting different things than they were 5, 10, 15 years ago. So making sure that you're bringing in leaders that understand that and can carry that forward. So windshield versus rear view mirror. What are the roles and responsibilities that they are going to need to fill? And then also, what relationships do they need to be able to maintain and grow? So a lot of succession planning is also about transfer of knowledge and growing skills, and it's also about transfer of relationships. So mapping out what that needs to look like and what skills they need to have to be able to maintain those relationships with partners, vendors, clients, etc. Next is really evaluating and choosing your successors, and choosing your successor candidates. You want to at least get it down to a short list. So you're going to be looking at, do they have an interest? Do they have the capabilities? Do they have the experience? It's not uncommon for, you see it a lot with family businesses, where the son or daughter that everyone expected to take over really just doesn't have the interest or desire. And that's, you're trying to force a square peg in a round hole, and it's not likely to be successful. So really, before you map out the story in your mind, make sure that you've really gauged interest to see if this is something that they want. And then, do they have the skills to do it? You also might run into a situation where you do want to say, hand it off to your son or daughter, but they're not going to be ready for 5, 10 years. So thinking through how you can bridge that gap is another piece of this that needs to be considered.
Another great point. I do that a lot with a number of businesses where they really need some additional executive support in that transition. And that's either done through an interim outside COO or CEO, or it's done through a different part of an ownership and governance structure where support can be provided in an ongoing and measured way that's able to contract and expand as necessary with their given stages of the business.
Yeah, yeah. I've seen clients also bring in other leaders as owners, but structuring it so that it's shared with the children, so that the owners, the other leaders can, kind of carry the organization along. The children are set up to be able to step in once they build that skills, and there's shared ownership and accountability, throughout there. So that brings, that gets a little bit more buy-in from those other leaders as well, because they do have ownership in the outcome too. So again, a lot of different ways of structuring this, but really thinking through who is the best fit here, not operating off of assumptions, because what got you here is not likely going to be necessarily the same thing that's going to carry you forward, and you want to make sure that you've really accounted for those capabilities. Also, I think it's important to consider whether or not the person that you're thinking is the best fit that you want in that chair. Are they going to be supported by the rest of your leadership team? Does the rest of your leadership team have buy-in with this person? Or is it going to be an uphill battle from day one? And do they truly embody the values and the vision of your organization? So all of these things. So evaluating your, so you've identified what the key critical pieces are. You're evaluating each of these candidates against those key critical pieces. Even if you're confident, you know who it is, run them through the process, get that objective view. And then step 4 is creating that knowledge transfer plan. So this is about not just the explicit knowledge, the processes and procedures, which you've definitely been developing and building out because you're focused on building value in your organization. But it's also about the implicit knowledge. Again, how do they apply that information? You know, these are the things, these are the skills that you've been developing over years and years. You need to start thinking about how you're going to coach and train this individual or these individuals to be able to navigate those situations without you. You know, and so this takes time. This takes diligence in planning, and you're going to gauge your progress as you go along. This is also an opportunity where you might want to think to yourself, okay, what does my involvement look like after the exit? Am I going to just cut the cord and be done? Or am I going to stay on in an advisory capacity to help facilitate this knowledge transfer over an extended period of time, even after I'm no longer driving the bus? So these are things to think about here. But this part, I think, is something to not underestimate. It also includes that relationship transfer piece. So this is where you might want to start thinking about, okay, I'm going to start bringing this person out into the field with me to meet with these people, or I'm going to have them in on the board meetings, or whatever that process looks like. But creating a way of transitioning your institutional knowledge over to the other person in a systematic and planned fashion is what I'm talking about here.
If we were in real time, this is a time where I would jump up and down and wave my nearly 6'10" wingspan and say, everybody pay attention to this one. This is probably the most underestimated and most impactful area that folks will overlook time and time again. Owners do not want to transition their business when they don't feel that the person knows what they need to know and is going to respond in the way that they would respond in a given situation. And so this knowledge transfer is so critically important for both facilitating the process forward, for the individual coming up, gaining more confidence and exposure across the organization, and frankly, for the non-family members that have spent sometimes decades or a couple of generations of their own family working for this business, because they want to make sure that their risk is going to be mitigated and that they're all going to be okay down the road. And it's a lot of these subtle pieces that are really important. In the coaching work that I do, I try and help those successor candidates really start to think through in a risk lens and listen in the way that the established owner is there. What would Mary do? What is Mary looking for? How does Mary put these pieces together in a way that makes sense so that Mary can deliver this decision across the company? So at this juncture, I'd bring my 6'10" wingspan back in and sit down, but hopefully you've gotten a point that this is something really important to pay attention to.
Yes, and just like you focus in on that successor and helping them think through that in a unique way, I've also worked on the flip side of that, taking the incumbent and saying, you know, listen, I know this feels you know, time consuming, and you know, it's not something that we're not naturally inclined to think about how to transfer knowledge, or what it's like that whole exercise of making the peanut butter and jelly sandwich, right? You're narrating that, and people are, you know, if they follow exactly, they're likely to have peanut butter all over the place, you know, because we aren't used to thinking that way and communicating it out kind of in a step-by-step fashion. And I think owners in particular run the risk of dismissing it because they think it's not necessary, or underestimating the complexity of it. And that's where good coaching can come in and really kind of help tease that out in a way that just makes it easier for them to say, oh, I get it now. I see the system for transitioning this information, and I see how I've assumed, because I've been used to executing on delivery of whatever it is I'm trying to do, I have assumed that people have a better understanding of what I'm doing than they actually do. So yes, I agree. This is probably the most critical piece. We have a whole module in our transition planning focused on this specifically, because it can be cumbersome at the beginning to kind of break it out, but it's so critical. So then developing your successor, so building out that plan. So this is mapping out all of those skills and competencies, identifying how you're going to train them on each of those pieces. Maybe it's they go to a training or a workshop. Maybe it's you bring in a consultant to offer some training specific to a skill set. Maybe it's a lot of shadowing work. The beautiful piece about this, particularly if you step back and you aren't just looking at this as, okay, I'm replacing myself, but when you start saying, okay, I need to start building out plans to grow my team so that as people are exiting, we aren't experiencing that pain that comes from not having people in the right positions, vacant positions, all that sort of thing. One of the beautiful things is as you start developing these plans, a lot of them can be repeated. So you're again helping people map out their roles and responsibilities in a way that is going to just continue to work to train people. It's what I'm trying to get at is cross training here. So it improves cross training throughout the organization by thinking through how to transition these skills and competencies down. So timelines, due dates, regular check-ins, make this an actual process with the end result being ahead of time who can fill the critical seats in your organization, particularly your organization. Bob, you're going to add something.
Yeah, and an area that I find that's often neglected is most of the family business owners that I work with are financially quite astute, and they have a great deal of their own identity and brand and success wrapped up in their understanding of finance. And more often than not, those folks are less inclined, patient, and tolerant to teach organizational finance to a successor. And so my hope is that Mike Sibley and James Moore, great folks there, could be a resource. Or I always tell people, make your CFO your best friend. Whether or not they have that experience or not, sometimes that won't come from the exiting leader, but it gosh darn sure needs to come from somebody else along the way.
Yeah. I hadn't thought about that, but that is true. I'm curious if you've, and obviously you'll protect confidentiality, but I'm curious if either of you have any examples of situations where you've seen that, where they've really had to rely on others in the organization to help develop and train the team. And if not, that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think it happens, I see it quite often. And I think when you get into some larger organizations or, especially specialty ones where you have like maybe a high degree of engineering as an example, and product development and things like that. And that's where you can get into some really interesting situations, particularly if the owner is highly involved in product development. And then they start building maybe a team of engineers, but how are they working with those the other product development engineers, and what do they let them do, and how do they and going through their processes? And so, you see that quite often, I think, in heavy engineering and product development type companies, both on both sides, where they do have the cross training, but on the other hand, they don't do the training. And so then it's like, well, who's going to develop the products in the future of this company?
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
Mike, really good points and super valuable. I think I could kind of get geeked out and dive way down into the rabbit hole, but it's not just about how do you manage a P&L and AR and AP, but it also becomes about a risk tolerance lens. And sometimes the existing generation has a different viewpoint in terms of cash in the bank. When and how much debt do you take on? What type of structure of debt is important? And the newer generations may have been exposed to many different new opportunities in the market and products and services that they have a pretty polar view on. And let's talk about friction in the transition and appointing a successor. That's where it happens. So please don't overlook these parts. They're nuanced, but they can become, as my British colleague once said, a snaggy bit. That's that little thread on your sweater, and all of a sudden you walk by something and it pulls it way out. understanding finance for the successor in the way that's the context of the person that's on their way out. That's a really hard thing to do, but super necessary.
Well, and I think, going back to that engineering example, I think sometimes when we've talked about this in the earlier session is not involving others in the financial discussions. To some degree, I think sometimes employees think to some degree there's maybe a bottomless check. They don't know what the cash standpoint, that they think they can keep developing, for example, or keep going down this road, but getting them involved. And oftentimes what we end up doing is, and I've got a client right now who's in the process of selling their business. And one of the things they've done really good over the years is they included management team in a monthly financial results. And here's what's going on. But part of that process, and I've worked with business owners on understanding what does working capital even mean? What is, what kind of credit policies, and then what is budgeting, and how do you get others in the organization involved in those conversations so they can see, so it's about, it's not just about being able to transfer knowledge like you guys have talked about in terms of just the focus on how do I do this job, or how do we do these series of jobs, but then how do these series of jobs relate to, hey, can the company keep running? We're a for-profit company, needs to, make money down, right, to be able to invest or get shareholder returns or whatever the case might be. How does that carry over? And so you can't just go down one side without going down the other.
Yeah. The other thing too, I think that I maybe failed to mention earlier on is, I don't know, like anyone that's been a leader for any length of time recognizes that it takes a long time to get your sea legs. And I think holding off on not creating opportunities for them to really develop, your successors to really develop not just their technical skills, but also their leadership skills, and then throwing them into a situation where they're now having to fill pretty big shoes can be incredibly challenging. And so starting this process earlier, doing all of those things that we just said, and really creating an opportunity for them to build their confidence and their leadership skills over time, I think, and find their own way of leading, and also by creating opportunities within the organization for them to practice that skill before they have to step in, you help them build credibility as a leader within the organization with their colleagues and teams, and that confidence in their abilities too. So that's another piece that I just wanted to mention. It's not just about giving them the knowledge to do what they need to do, but the practice at leading, the practice at making decisions at a smaller scale where the risk is less, so that when they are able to step in, they're ready to go. The last step is really checking in on progress. And again, I think this, what I'm getting at here is really just making this a process and system. And ideally, you're not just doing this around your position, but you're considering the other key roles in your organization. So revisit and reassessing and making sure that you're seeing the progress that you need to, that the investment on the part of the successor remains high, or your successor candidates remain high. And then also good to have a plan B, because things change, and knowing that you've got a second or even third option on the ready is a smart thing to do, because people's motives change, people's family lives change, locations change, which nowadays is less of an issue than in the past, but still something to be considered. So those are really the key pieces there. I want to make sure that I actually throw in the, I'm ending early to make up for ending late on the last one. I want to make sure that I throw in the chat box here, the link for the successor guide. I encourage you all, it's just a PDF. I encourage you to download it. Like I said, it's got a great successor evaluation form that you can, candidate evaluation form that you can use to gauge your candidates around. It'll help you map out those competencies, both the technical and the soft skills, but then it also gives you a form to help gauge where they are at across those competencies, and then some really cool questions to dig into to get you thinking about that specific person's ability. So let me throw this into the chat box.
while you're posting that, Heather, I just want to jump back into, some of the financial side. What are kind of referred to is financial literacy.
Mhm.
And at the end of the day, and this is no, not meant to be anything disparaging towards anybody. It's just, when whether people are going through school and college, and then coming up through organizations, there's not a lot of time spent on the financial literacy side of things. And that goes both personally for a lot of people, and then even business is even more complicated. And you do get to a point where I'll see and be part of meetings and people understand, hey, I understand what my department does from a P&L budget standpoint, or even the owner will understand, hey, I understand what my cash balance is. I understand what my income statement is saying, my P&L is saying. They don't really understand the balance sheet, how important the balance sheet really is in the grand scheme of things. So we start talking about assets and liabilities and working capital and how all that interacts. That financial literacy is a really good thing, not only for the business owner to know and understand, but also to pass that on along, because it's going to be, whether there's going to be an internal transfer at some point, a transfer to a family member. And actually, when you get into family members, I've seen way too many cases where the children down the line who might be taking over, they may be really, really good at helping operations in the business, but they've never seen the financial statements. And I've had situations where a year or so prior to a transition in family, where we started meeting with the family and the kids to go through, what does a balance sheet mean? What does a P&L? And we walk through every month, we go through the monthly results, and here's what happens. Here's what happens with the customer base. Here's why you wanted to first go through all these things. So when they take over, they understand exactly what's happening. And I think that's one of the critical misses in particular with family transitions. It doesn't happen early enough in that process. And that's why I think that financial literacy is really, really critical earlier on. And again, there's ways to do it in a way that can protect really confidential information, but there's certain information that can go out there that can really help people understand. And I think when people understand what's happening financially, that gives them some ownership and some buy-in into making things happen, and their ability to help push the organization forward and even be more profitable.
Yeah, and talking about earlier, what the organization is going to need in the future. And I made a comment about how the workforce is changing and expectations are changing. I do think that there's a growing expectation of more transparency on the part of the business owner to the employees. But to your point, I think having that transparency without an understanding of how to apply that knowledge can be a pretty scary thing. And that's an area where I think not only do we need to get better as leaders at explaining what that data means, but also we as leaders need to know how to use it. And so when I was leading my organization, that was something I constantly struggled with, because my background was psychology and therapy. It certainly wasn't finance, right? So I'm trying to understand, not just trying to understand what these reports mean and what are all of these numbers that are going into them, but then actually knowing what to do with them and how to forecast and how to make decisions. And then explaining that to my team was just like, that was difficult. And that was a constant challenge. And I think it's probably even more of a challenge for smaller scale businesses to be able to find good advisors that will not just give them the numbers, but help them understand how that they and their leadership team can then use those numbers. So that's something that I applaud James Moore for doing, because I think you all do a great job of helping people forecast in that way and understand their financial information in a way that a lot of other advisors don't. So
if I could jump in, Heather, and just kind of as a comment, let people know that if we tie these first two together, increasing the value of your business and choosing a successor, please know that they're very linked, in that some family businesses that choose a successor at the wrong time get a dramatic reduction in the value of their company, because there's not enough established track record with the individual. Also, some families, when they're getting ready to sell their business, may want to have had the opportunity for their son or daughter or other family member to step up and take the leadership roles. And depending on who you sell the business to and how it's structured, that may be taken away by you choosing to sell your business. So they are very connected in the right cases, and when it's done in the right way with the right planning. The successor in the new role for long enough with demonstrated value adds greater growth trajectory for the company, which equates to a higher end of the multiple rather than the medium or the low end. So they're very connected. It's quite nuanced. It has to do an awful lot with communication. Mike was talking about how that's communicated. There's a number of times where I've worked with teams, organizations, and families about how to communicate what you do, how you do it, what happens with the business and where it's going. And that in and of itself creates a higher alignment to the higher multiples. So these pieces all fit together. We can look at them individually as trees, but understanding where the forest is in terms of that proverbial sale and greater valuation relative to succession, not only for the lead, but all the other positions really does matter. So make sure you're thinking about that, or including people that can help you think about that in a lot of different ways.
Well, I think I want to go back to something Heather said earlier too, and in terms of choosing the successor, or choosing, at what point are you getting your organization ready? And I can say, I've seen examples of this just in the last year of waiting until you're ready to sell and trying to sell that business now, and you haven't done anything to prepare. You lose a lot of leverage. And it's one thing if you're going to keep it within the family and do some moving. There's a lot of steps to be prepared for that. Don't get me wrong. But if you're going third party to sell the business and you haven't done a lot of this preparation and got the things in place, you do start to lose the leverage. In other words, your multiple may be a lot lower that you're getting. That asking price that you're trying to get, you may not get that because I've seen too many business owners see through a due diligence process, whittle away a little bit here, a little bit there, and they're not willing to push and to go. They just want to get the deal done now because they're desperate, because they're tired, they're sick, they've got some reason that they need to get out now. And without that preparation, without all the things that Heather was just talking about in this, you will lose leverage, and it'll be very difficult to get that purchase price that you're looking for. And with that, it's just a matter of then saying, okay, how do we mitigate? How do we get the best we can? That's why you go back to that slide Heather showed earlier. This discovery phase and understanding all these things is super important to the process, so we can understand the goals, the timeframes, and things of that nature to get it to the right spot.
I think that's a great note to end on. So we'll go ahead and hop off now. And we'll be right back at 12 o'clock, where we're going to dig into all the things you need to know about family transition. So we'll see you at 12 o'clock, everyone.